This was all the way back to 1493 until 1512. And so cattle were taking up space to basically push indigenous people off of the land that they were growing food on. And so this is really important to recognize how this language all moves together. Also, beyond that, Western colonization on the religious realm, Dominion-based religions, whether you want to change it to your perspective or not, states literally that dominion over everything, and it's not controllable. And it's not controllable. And so when you think about the dominion-based religions and who, and every man, indigenous, black, brown, no, man at that time was white man. And so when a white man believed he was in power, dominion over animals and people, and we maintain a structure until the beginning of the Constitution. What happened in the Constitution? It was designed to be an agrarian society. That's an agriculture society, which means no matter what the farmer population is, they will always have power. It was designed that way. Thomas Jefferson is an agrarian philosopher. So now you move on to how it affects the vegan movement, Western colonization. This is how. 90% of the people in here, I bet, are doing some sort of activism, and this is great, doing some sort of activism that drives social change on how somebody consumes animal products. And so we believe that by consuming more vegan food that we're going to save animals, and we're sleeping on systemic change. So what are we doing? And we're taking Western colonization idea of capitalism, and we're making vegan capitalism. We're making vegan billionaires. We're making these vegan investor food billionaires who don't even care how many animals are saved and have the power to figure it out. But guess what? They're not in the Capitol trying to quantify how many animals are saved each year. When you crunch the numbers, you realize that production is not actually a byproduct of supply and demand in the food system. And this was a hard reality that I spoke to a lot of people for the last 4 years before I started policy stuff, that supply and demand is rigged in our food system. Western colonization impacts that in the vegan movement because, again, we're so connected to capitalism that we so badly want capitalism to solve it. And so all this data that I crunched, did people take me seriously? No. The biggest challenge I had in the vegan movement was it meat eaters, politicians letting me sit in their offices? No, it was the vegan movement not believing that my data crunching was legit. So what we end up moving towards is this idea that we're continuing to take the status quo of who arrived here and was control of the cattle, who then created this democracy, who then are the CEOs, who then are the political representation, and then who then are leaders of the vegan movement orgs that are taken seriously. And that's what this conversation you brought is. So we're trying to share how hard we work. And a lot of the work, it's not to create the systemic change. It's with the vegan movement, like gatekeeping and blocking us. So.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think Connie and Louisa have expressed a lot of incredible thoughts, and I think one of the things that I would just like to add is that I think when we speak about colonization, I think we have to also acknowledge how these forms of exploitation and abuse have allowed even the people that are perpetrating these crimes and atrocities to not be their higher selves. We are normalizing abuse towards non-human animals and to ourselves also. So it almost creates it does create a system in a society where we are normalizing this exploitation towards others and ourselves. And when we do that, we can't we aren't working on being the best versions of ourselves when we're operating in a system where exploitation and abuse is normalized across the board. So if we're going to ever reach collective liberation, animal liberation, non-human animal liberation, all types of ending of discriminations, we have to be the best versions of ourselves. And what Western colonization has done is commodified our bodies as humans. It has commodified non-human animals' bodies as things and objects. And to Connie's point, we're putting these objects now into capitalism, into looking at the rate of return, looking at the return on investment. And when we look at individuals and beings through that lens, there's no way that we're going to achieve the world that we want to see if we are viewing not only non-human animals as objects, but honestly ourselves as objects also. So I think that's one of the biggest things that has been a consequence of Western colonization on our world today.
Something that we discussed earlier and we brought it up. You know, we don't want to be here talking about Black and Indigenous issues. We don't want to be here talking about the responsibility of white wealth. We want to be up here talking about how to best strategize for animal liberation. And so what this does is keep us busy, and it really takes away the focus just for us, right? We have to do 10 times the amount of work, 20 times the amount of work, because we're working on multiple issues and we don't get a choice. We don't get to decide. We don't get to put it in a box. I can't wake up tomorrow and say, you know, I'm no longer me. I'm no longer Afro-Indigenous. Chris is no longer Black. You know, Connie herself, which a lot of people may not know, is also part half Indigenous as well. And so I think that's something to think about, is how busy it keeps us. And already many of you perhaps have been tired, have suffered from exhaustion, from burnout. And if that is from, if you're a person of privilege, right, whether that's financial privilege, whether that's a racial and skin privilege, think about how much more we're working on and how busy this is keeping us. But just like all of you, what we want to focus on is strategizing for animal liberation. And this is why this is such an urgent matter, and this is why we're fighting for collective liberation.
Western colonization has affected the lives of all beings and has led to spaces that are inaccessible and lack representation. So my next question would be, what does decolonization look like in practice?
Start over there, but don't be sure to pass on the mic.
Yeah, I think it kind of looks like this, like, okay, I'm looking at the audience. The audience, it's more diversity here than it was in 2019, but I think what it looks like is the audience is probably going to be flipped when we're talking about how it looks in the future. So we're going to look out into a role of people, and we won't be the quote-unquote minority. I think we're going to be a lot more largely represented in these conversations. I think what we are having right now is a lot of solutions, a lot of ideas that aren't from our frame of reference, that aren't from our ideology, that aren't including our experiences. And I think in order for us to get to that next level, we're going to have to include more perspectives from a variety of individuals, and not just races. I mean, honestly, different age groups, able-bodied people, just a variety of concepts that haven't really been normalized in this movement, in my experience. So I think what's going to have to happen is the paradigm is going to have to shift, and we're going to have a lot more of the people of the global majority leading these conversations.
So on my end, I wouldn't have even been here, not on behalf of AVA or any of the people that organized it, if it wasn't for Eloisa extending and reaching out to me. And this and Yvette as well. So this entire panel, you know, nothing against the organizers of the event, but we do have to take some accountability that it can't just be this like edge case. It can't just be this one panel. It can't just be relying on the Black, Brown, Indigenous person who you invited to introduce you to the rest of the Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. It needs to be the leadership of these organizations being equally represented by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. I mean, this is across the board. And so, in my opinion, decolonization within our movement, but our movement being a micro of the macro, which is businesses, politicians, the entire world, we are in a situation where I would say that it isn't just representation, it's over scrutiny. The amount of over scrutiny that I have received, and I sit in an interesting position, right? You see that, so I'll tell you my background. My background is that I'm Bolivian and German. I grew up in Oklahoma in a smallish city. A city that had a railroad track that didn't allow Black people on the other side. My white dad had privilege. My brown mom, who, while they took on the Bolivian Spanish side, they weren't. They did that to cover up the indigenous structures, which obviously made them a lower class. My mom had a totally different experience. So if I'm a child and I'm with one or the other, I'm watching it play out. So the point I'm trying to make is I'm not just experiencing, like there in certain geographics and my family, xenophobia. I'm also an ally, right? Like I'm an ally. There are many cities, DC's one of them, LA's one of them, where the Black and brown demographic is the majority, and I have privilege in those communities, and that's why oftentimes I stay in those communities. But if I go, and so I have to do much more ally work in Los Angeles, right? Whereas in Oklahoma, where you have so much history of deaths, like you have you have a clue, but living there, you have an even bigger clue. For me, I don't even like going back there, but when I go back there, I experience it too. And so what I'm trying to say is, like, when it comes to the over scrutiny of us, is that I would like to see us put more Black, brown, and indigenous people in leadership positions, not just the DEI part of the company or the part of your website, but put us in more leadership positions. Trust us with more funding, whether it's food innovation, whether it's nonprofit funding. It's not just the 10% of the 10%. And then beyond that, when we're giving information, the over scrutiny has got to stop. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the stuff I do later. And if you need to, close your eyes and imagine the demographic that we're talking about saying those things, and see if you have a different perspective on what is coming out of my mouth in the sequential questions later on.
Thank you, Connie. I'll just start by saying that in reference to your point of me reaching out to you, to Yvette and to Chris, there's a lot of people here that know me, and I think one of the things that they say often is that, Elisa, you do a lot of stuff, right? It's because I don't have a choice. Animals are dying by the billions, by the trillions every day. I have an urgency in my heart and in my gut that I wanted to end yesterday. When I talk about it, it makes me so emotional, and I just want to cry because I have never been able to understand, even though I intellectualized it, well-versed, well-studied, why we do what we do as humans and the amount of healing that we have to do and the re-traumatization that we do. We traumatize each other by building system upon system upon system that doesn't serve us, doesn't serve the planet, doesn't serve our beyond human relatives. And I'll give you a little bit of my background as well, why decolonization is so important to me. I come from an island that if I were to ask you what island it is and where Christopher Columbus landed first and made the first colony in AVA, which maybe many of you refer to as the New World, you perhaps don't know. So does anybody know which the first colony in the New World was?
Hispaniola.
Oh, so Connie knew, right? So often what happens is that we get erased out of the conversation. We were the first to experience genocide. We were the first to experience enslavement, and a lot of people don't know that before indigenous African people, because Black people are displaced indigenous people, I just want to say that very clearly. We experienced it all. And my ancestors, my Arawak ancestors, were enslaved. And the reason why Columbus went to Africa is because he needed more people. That's rarely talked about. My ancestors lived not only in the Caribbean, but they extended as far as Florida, as well as a lot of research pointing to California as well. And since the 1990s, and even before, my family on this island has been fighting for land back. We were taking care of a small island that belongs to Dominican Republic, and we also own other land. But because we didn't exploit the land, because the land was wild, the government said, hey, I guess you're not using the land, and basically rented and gave the land to Europeans and North American companies. This case went to the Latin American high courts. They ruled in our favor, and even though we had all the paperwork, they still have not given us anything, not even paying rent. And so we were not looking to displace these businesses that were there. They're already there, they're built, they're building more, unfortunately. And we have no other way to fight, right? We don't have the resources, we don't have the money. So what I'm talking about is active action. And the reason why I bring up the story is because decolonization has been used a lot in the last couple of years. It's become a trending word, just like anti-racism, just like DEI. And a lot of people think that it's just a way of us addressing a certain issue or the way that we think, but it is active resistance. And I want you to really think about that. It is tangible action. It isn't just dismantling what we think about someone else. It is opening your purse. It is giving us money for all the labor, for all the land. And it looks like in practice, putting people in positions of power, dismantling the nonprofit industrial complex, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and which upholds all these power structures that are not beneficial to animals. And there's a distinction there, and decoloniality is, thank you, Renee. Decoloniality is really what deals with us dismantling our belief system. And so we have to be very mindful in when we talk about decolonization, because it's gonna make us uncomfortable. It's gonna make us share. It's gonna make us build community. And it's gonna make us really think about how we look at others. One of the first questions that settlers and colonizers had when they came over to this land was, are indigenous people human? So that was the starting point. That was the first philosophical debate that these folks were having when they landed here in search for wealth, right? And all of this has been driven by wanting economic wealth, by imperialism. None of this would have been possible if governments across the world, across Europe, hadn't funded it, right? So that should give you a perspective of what funding can do. Funding can either take you more in a process of liberation, or it can take you to completely destroy something that is beautiful, where people are living in community. And this is why it's so important to diversify our movement, to really be responsible with our wealth, where we put it. A lot of what we see now, because that wealth is so concentrated, is a lack of supporting actions that perhaps are seen as radical, that are seen as outside the box, and that hurts our movement. This is not 5 organizations. This is a social justice movement, and we really need to move towards that direction and not be, oh, the weird kid in the corner who's trying to save the chicken and is vegan. And so decolonization looks like active resistance. It looks like tangible action. It looks like sharing resources, putting people in positions of power, and really dismantling those structures that are oppressing beyond human persons, ourselves, and really preventing not just their liberation, but our own liberation. If we're doing liberatory praxis and liberation work, we have to include ourselves in that. We are not outside of that. We are a part of it, right? A lot of times we talk about how we're all animals. We are all animals, and we're all being marginalized when we're interrupted, and when that development and that relationship is being dictated by only those who are in positions of power.
I did not anticipate getting so choked up, sitting here listening. These words resonate so much with me. And I hope that sometime in the near future, Connie Spence will lead a session, a workshop on allyship, what that looks like, what that actually is, what that could be and should be, because, and I know you touched on it just a little bit, but I haven't really seen it, you know, and so it looks like with Connie, it looks like being offered a platform, and before you even take one step, she says, have you met Eloisa? Have you met Chris? Have you met Yvette? Before I step myself. And she's taught me so much, and that choked me up, obviously. But Eloisa mentioned the nonprofit industrial complex, and I did want to get into that, so we'll move there. Historically, the nonprofit industrial complex has upheld power imbalances that harm Black and Indigenous people. So my question to the panel is, why is it important to fund collective liberation efforts?
Well, I mean, again, think about it with the capitalistic lens. Nonprofits are a formula in a lot of ways, and that formula is with big nonprofits that are bringing in millions of dollars, let's be clear, 90%, you look at their C3, you know, tax papers, right? They're 990. You see that 90% of their funds go into building their team, their assets, and about 10% of their funds go into the movement. So if you send your money to these giant nonprofits, you send $100, $10 is going into driving veganism, and $90 is going to a bunch of operations. And so I'm not saying that it exists necessarily in the vegan movement, but that's the formula, and that formula is used across the country. That's why you see, you know, dozens of nonprofits that are trying to solve homelessness, and you're like, wow, they get so much money. Why are they not solving homelessness? Nonprofits play a crutch for the government. Our taxes already have enough money to solve all these problems, and the government relies on nonprofits to do it. So if we in parallel have representation of the government being mostly white male, in nonprofits, if we start having leadership be mostly white male in the macro, and then in the vegan movement, if we also see a lot of these nonprofits being mostly white male led, then where is that money going? Is it the 90% 10? With flipping that and starting to see more representation from C3s, C4s, and C6s, those are just different nonprofit, you know, from policy to advocacy and beyond, you will start seeing different communities being accessed. And those communities being accessed are going to spread the movement faster. It's going to spread veganism faster. You can't keep the same formula for all these different things and say it's working and let's dismantle this thing with the same formula. And so we just have to flip the formula, and what we're asking, and again, I appreciate every person, you know, so many seats are filled in here. Eloisa mentioned this is a tough subject, and I am, for the 5 people that know me in this room, you know that my personal Instagram is just ranting at everything. Because I feel like I have the ingredients to fix the system with lobbying and representation, and if it's the vegan movement, I'm ranting about it. If it's Los Angeles Latinx city council being racist to Black people, I'm saying, like, why is this happening? Because they use Latinx people, you know, to get into these realms, to get the brown vote, and they know exactly who they're putting in those positions. And it doesn't represent all of us, but the point is like the distribution of money has to be done. And so overall, I appreciate every one of you for coming in here. And what I would like to see is that we advance the mega nonprofits and make them accountable. If they bring in $10 million, if they bring in $30 million, they bring in $50 million. And if you don't know who brings in 50, 30, and 15 million, find out, because they're all the names that you know. And find out who's in their leadership positions. Find out who's in their board positions. And let's hold them accountable, because as soon as we flip that, we're gonna flip who gets funded.
have, I think, a slightly like and a hate relationship with the nonprofit industrial complex, just to start off with. I think that it flattens resistance. I think we get comfortable. I think that we become afraid because we want the magic solution. We want the magic answer, the magic pill that's going to transcend all of this oppression that we are facing and that our beyond human relatives are facing. As a person who works a lot in policy, I see how harmful it is a lot of the times. I see that a lot of times organizations actually take money away from the people who are in need. And some of those organizations are plant-based organizations, some of them are vegan organizations, and where I have seen that, they're nonprofits and they're plastered all over their social media and their website, all, indigenous people and Black people and all of this diversity, and everybody is white. And so they come with a solution to the funders and say, hey, we're going to work on this issue and we're going to work for Black and indigenous people, and they take money out of our pockets. And while doing that very same thing, we're tokenized, right? We either become the folks that need help and need to be saved, or we become the folks that have to talk about DEIJ all the time, right? And there's a story there. I'm not just a marginalized person. I'm a person who is living in her entire being, who comes into every space with everything that makes her up. I mean, I'm vegan, I'm Afro-Indigenous. I never hold anything back because I think we have to show up in all spaces as who we fully are. And when we don't, we suffer. When we don't, animals suffer. And so with that nonprofit industrial complex, the reason why we have to diversify this funding is because the world is not just one type of people. And if we want animal liberation, we're going to have to include everyone, no matter how uncomfortable that is. And that's just not Black and indigenous people, but that means different perspectives. That means really working towards a world not dominated, but really led by us, right? And I think that that's challenging to think about because we have centered ourselves so much, right? Even in our own work, a lot of times when there is a story about an animal being rescued, it's always the human story. We are obsessed with the hero narrative, right? Which is another part of this complex. We forget about the 100 people that it took for that to happen. And funding is so important because I think, I talk a lot of flattening resistance, and I think when we look at a lot of these funders, they're afraid, right? They're afraid to share the power. They're afraid to share the wealth. They're not going to look at a little Black girl in New York who may want to start a program to really talk about sustainability from an animal perspective and an animal ethic perspective. And I bring up the story because at Vegan Activist Alliance, we don't have a ton of money, right? And part of that is because I actually haven't wanted to spend the time kissing up to funders. It's like, you know what? If they want me, they're gonna find me because I'm doing too much work and I'm working on behalf of my beyond human relatives. And that relationship has to change. We have to educate funders. The large organizations, if you're here in the room, you have to tell them what's not working. And it's as simple as that. You have to let them know the campaigns that are not working, the policy that you're pursuing that may sound good to these funders, but in reality, we're not attaining anything. Year after year after year, animal exploitation goes up globally. The numbers are not coming down. So if we're not going to sit in a room and talk to each other and talk about what's not working and continue with pushing consumerism and not understand that this is a social justice movement, we need radical action. We cannot continue flattening resistance. And the funders need to hear this because they're so afraid to perhaps fund open rescue or perhaps fund disruptions. Or in our case, a lot of the times, activism looks different in different communities. You cannot go to an indigenous community that doesn't have water to drink, and this is happening in the US because I work on these issues, and tell them this is the one thing that you need to focus on, and otherwise you're not a good human and you're killing babies, right? I think that's a lot of the approach. There's a lot of anti-indigeneity in our movement. And so, I For me, it's challenging because it's like, yes, we want this funding, but what does that mean? Does that mean that these funders are going to be prescriptive in what we have to do? If you want this movement to change, and if there's any funders in the room, you're going to have to fund creative ideas that are risky. You're going to have to take risks. You might lose money. You might not get a return on your investment because this is social justice and there's no magic formula. There's no way, and there's a great book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. And so if you want liberation, the first part of it is understanding that you may have to give up some of your power, that you may have to take those risks in order for us to work on behalf of our beyond human relatives.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that often gets overlooked in this movement is that when we speak about why it's important to fund collective liberation work, is that we are the humans doing the work on behalf of the non-human animals. So we can't ignore a lot of the things that happen to us as individuals, as humans, and how that impacts the work that we can do. So, like on a personal level, I know my path to being an executive director in the animal protection movement is drastically different from most of the people that are executive directors in this movement. I know I get paid a lot less. I know I don't get as many opportunities. I know my path to even being in a position to honestly devote my full time to animal advocacy is much different from a lot of the people in power in this movement. And that's the difference between equality and equity. So, on paper, I may be equal to a lot of these heads of organizations, but in terms of equity, I know I don't make the same amount. I know I was raised on below poverty line levels for the vast majority of my life, and practically I'm still there. I know that I went to actions with holes in my shoes, with only a few pair of clothes to have as an activist, but that's what it took for someone like me to be able to devote myself full time to advocating for animal rights. And I just know that part of funding collective liberation work is acknowledging that for some people, the path to even be in this movement is going to be drastically different. And when we only look at the results of how many animals were saved, or when we only analyze from a statistic and analytical perspective, we completely ignore all of those other elements that it takes for people who are marginalized to even be a part of this movement. So I just know personally, like I said, I'm pretty sure all of our experiences, like Connie just spoke to, being heavily scrutinized. So just imagine, you go through what Eloisa experienced coming up, and then you get to the point where you're working like myself to work full-time in this movement, living on food stamps and only a few pair of clothes. Then you get into this movement and your work is overly scrutinized, heavily scrutinized, and you're not even taking into account what we had to do to even get here as activists. I think that's why it's important that we fund, that the movement is funding collective liberation, because our work takes all of those things into account. We are obviously heavily focused on the animals, and the animals are going to be the center of what we do. But we know all of the extra weight that we carry. We know that burden that we carry just to be in this movement. And I think when we don't fund those initiatives, it ignores all of those things that we have to go through, and we eliminate those perspectives before they are even allowed to be at the table.
Thank you. We do have time for one more question. I'm going to pass it back to Eloisa.
I just want to add that we are extremely resourceful people. We have had to survive 529 years of marginalization, and we're still here. So that says a lot about how far your money is going to go when you fund us. So just wanted to throw that in there, because we can do so much much with so little. And we need grassroots organizing power. We are not going to achieve anything in any of what we want if we do not understand that from that perspective. This movement is made up by everybody who's here. It's not made up by 5 organizations. So open your purse and give us the money.
Very true. I can attest. I have seen a lot accomplished with so little within our communities. As I mentioned, we do have time for one more question, and then I will move into Q&A. So please submit your questions during the panel. And Eloisa, you led in a perfect segue. Tell me, what are you currently working on, everyone? And how could proper funding for those initiatives impact the animal liberation movement?
Okay. So right now, the thing that I am working on is my nonprofit Apex Advocacy, and Apex stands for Animal Protection, Equality, Intersectionality, and it hits to what I was just talking about, making sure that in our work that we don't ignore the things that our activists and the people that we're focused on go through just to be a part of this movement. Right now we're working on 3 main campaigns. So we have a campaign called No Backyard Slaughter, and we are specifically looking at backyard slaughterhouses in Black and brown communities and trying to get them taken away from those communities. So initially we started out with a pressure campaign focusing on putting pressure on the county to enforce the actual laws of that county to remove this slaughterhouse from the county. And you know, that's been a challenge because the county is kind of turning up the line, just not really paying attention to the situation because they don't really prioritize a situation like a backyard slaughterhouse in the county. So what we're doing is we're putting pressure on the county to uphold the law. You know, it's about making sure that people don't have to sleep next to a slaughterhouse where animals are being killed and shot. No one wants to live next to a slaughterhouse. We don't want slaughterhouses in our communities and in the world, but we absolutely don't want them next door where we can see animal bodies decomposing, where we can see blood and feces and how that impacts the soil that we literally live next door to. This slaughterhouse that I'm speaking about specifically is down the street from an elementary school. So for years, elementary school students have been walking past this slaughterhouse on their way to school. So we're working to try and remove slaughterhouses that are ran in backyards out of Black and brown communities because that decreases property value. It negatively impacts the environment in these situations. So that's one thing that we're working on. We're working also on a program called Black Vegan Everything, where we showcase Black-owned vegan businesses, and we have a website dedicated to all of these businesses, and we want to create a community for all of these businesses to interact and learn more about each other, to share their jobs that they are hiring for, and also circulate Black dollars around veganism and empower Black-owned vegan businesses. So that's the second initiative that we're working on. And the third initiative is something that some of you may be familiar with, is the Global Majority Caucus, which is essentially a platform where we bring activists of color together and have them network and share community space, have space for their mental health and well-being, and we're essentially trying to create a community of activists of color. So those are the 3 things that we're working on, but in terms of funding and what we could do with more funding, honestly, I haven't really been able to allow myself to think outside of operating on a month-to-month basis. Like, I haven't had funds to even think big. So honestly, it'll allow more space for me to even breathe and have an idea of what we could do in a year or 2. And when you're I can't speak for Connie and Eloisa, but I get the feeling that along with activists like myself, we don't have the opportunity to have 2-year plans, 3-year plans, what we're gonna do in 5 or 10 years. For me, I'm trying to just keep the lights on at my organization on a month-to-month basis. And I know a lot of people are also in that position that may not be like me, Connie, and Eloisa, but I just hear that a lot with activists of color in this movement, that we don't get the opportunity to have far-reaching ideas. And if we do, we don't really have the strategy to map it out, because we don't know if we're going to be around in a year, or if we are, we may only have volunteers. So there's so many elements that will allow, I know, someone like me and my organization to flourish with, if I'm able to think long term. But honestly, I'll be real, it's not something that I've had a lot of time. I can't even spend a lot of the time and energy thinking about what we could do in a year with funding, or in 2 years, because I have to really focus on what we're going to do in a month or two. So that's one of the situations that come with, not really having funding long term.
Chris is amazing, and I actually met him through Eloisa as well, and I just want to mention that piggybacking off of some of those sites and programs that he has, without funding, they lay kind of dormant. And not dormant because the idea and everything isn't there, dormant because the movement isn't supporting it, and there are great ideas that need to be expanded. A all-black vegan website is amazing. Like, that should be one of the biggest shared URLs ever. It gives people that call themselves allies the ability to support those organizations, right? It could turn into its own perfect commerce and beyond and networking site. So I just wanted to say, I don't want people to sleep on that. Another thing I don't want people to sleep on is maybe what I'm working on. And if you know Vegan Batgirl, she was the most fun person ever with the vegan Batman light and putting light messages on walls and dealing with police every night and helicopters coming. It was the best time of my life. And I'd still be doing it if I didn't start crunching the numbers. I've been vegan for over 12 years, and my career has somehow taken me into sort of the advertising data software data space. I never knew I'd be in data, but here I am, and it's like data business development. So when I started doing the vegan Batman light and meeting all these vegans everywhere and calculating in my head, man, I really feel like we're hitting a point where animals should be saved. And then I went to the USDA and I looked at the last 20 years of production, and I'm like, wait a second, why is dairy still going up? And then I looked at, they were bailed out twice that year, and I'm like, this isn't making sense to me at all. I pivoted to someone who's super serious now. I mean, no kidding, you see me and I'm super serious now. I pivoted to founding a vegan-backed lobbying group. I am meeting on Monday with politicians on Constitution Avenue, and this is my second time in person meeting. I was there a month ago meeting with Republican offices in buildings that legitimately have the names on them of politicians still that were part of the KKK. I had stayed away, so 3 years ago I pivoted from Vegan Batgirl, and I was like, hey, I guess I start researching the entire history of the food system. I start looking at the data, and I was floored at, how rigged the system was, and I decided to take it to all my Vegan Batgirl fans, and I said, we need a lobby, and I wanted to centralize everybody's money and voices so that we could hire lobbyists. I actually thought there was already a vegan-backed lobbying group. To my, confusion, there wasn't really a consumer-focused or a public-focused one at that time. It was much more the production or the plant-based food companies. Agriculture Fairness Alliance was founded, and instead of paying myself, I rushed all that money, and I have 3 lobbyists now with the most limited budget. I work full-time till 6 p.m. as actually a pretty big wig data person, and then at 6 p.m. until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. every night, I work on Agriculture Fairness Alliance. I partition parts of my day where I have meetings with politicians on Zoom, and I actually stayed away from going in person because I thought there's no way they're gonna listen to me. I'm gonna quarterback these lobbyists in, these white males that are growing them up, and And they're the perfect ones to get this legislation that we have passed. It was a farmer transition legislation. Go Renee on having the sort of prototype of the public model, which basically this is making the government subsidize it so it can scale to literally every farmer that wants to do it. And then, so again, I know this is a little bit long-winded, but I swear like I'm going somewhere. What I'm working on now is that I realize that I'm actually really good at lobbying. I was in those meetings with my lobbyists, and these Republican politicians were saying stuff like, you know, we never go against our livestock farmers. They're like the majority of our district. And, you know, we just want to focus on subsidies and stuff for them. And I said, well, how many, so my lobbyist said something to the effect of, yeah, I know how the barnyard is. And he pauses. And he is a lifetime super professional lobbyist. And I said, well, how many fruit and vegetable producers do you have? And they're like 20 to 30%. And I'm like, so what you're saying is that you don't want to help them? And they're like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. Well, wouldn't it be beneficial to basically give them some of this money? And literally, I also have all that data to prove that the other side's getting overpaid and there's all this fraud. And guess who has next steps with them? And I just realized, like, I don't have the network that they have, but we need to be taking up space here. We need these 4 people. EA is someone else that I think would be great. We need to be here for the Farm Bill. It expires in September. It is the biggest food policy in the world. It is $800 billion of spending that lasts for 10 to 15 years, and it'll literally set the stage for everything you don't want to happen, all going to big ag, or it'll heal this planet. Sorry, my mouth is dry. With that said, if I were to say where I need funding and what I want to do next, I can't burn the candle at both ends anymore. I can't be the super humble person about what I need or want anymore. I am making it happen there. These people are making it happen. We need to live here. Those doors of that office, the Capitol Police came up to me and said, who are you? Why are you here? And I said, what do you mean? Thinking like they're interrogating me. We never see people like you walk through these doors. Yeah, because they're all cowboys walking through these doors. Why are we all in DC right now and like 3 of us are meeting with politicians? We're sleeping on it. I'm not saying that. Hold on. I'm not saying that we can't do the other activism. I'm saying we're sleeping on one of the most important ingredients of this activism, which is unrigging all that money, which is our tax dollars. Consumer dollars aren't the only way this industry exists. We can't just focus on consumer dollars. We're not going to eat our way into freedom. We literally need to be here, and immediately. We need to be here the moment that politicians get sworn in after January, and we need to be living here until September, and we need to give it our best shot. If I were to say what is our movement's best shot, fund us to be here and have meetings every day and not just think about the animals. We're again, Eloisa said we're a whole person. I'm going to be thinking about accessibility to every farmer and accessibility to the symbiotic relationship to every consumer. I'm not going to just go in there and talk about animals. I will, because they won't vote on animals. Republicans will never vote on animals. So you have to trick them into voting on things that holistically take care of it all. And through that, we build the economic wealth of Black and brown farmers. We flip who's in control of the food system that way. And on the other side, we make sure that vegan food is on every shelf in every crevice of America, and the food will sell itself so we won't feel so desperate to tell everybody to eat beans and rice every day. That is all.
Very big appreciation that we've had lately at Vegan Activist Alliance and Chili's on Wheels. And just think about this and think about the fact that we don't have funding and the funding that we need. We were able to include provisions, and those provisions were included in Child Nutrition Reauthorization for plant-based school food on a federal level, as well as plant-based milk. They passed the House Ed and Labor Committee. Language was also included in the House Ag Appropriations, and we're also working on introducing at a state level a bill that will defund the horse racing industry. It is very, very challenging. Thank you. It is extremely challenging to work on policy when you don't have funding. It is extremely challenging to have lobbyists if you don't have funding. You need money. And all of those wins at the federal level or at the state level informing budget and informing policy have come about because I know how to work relationships, right? And I think we all need to do that. However, that didn't come because I got $200,000 to develop a policy program within my organizations. It really has come from those practices that I was taught as a child of mutual aid, of reaching out, of building community. And that has led to those wins. It has also led to us having programming to mobilize people at the local level and build grassroots organizing power. Our programming is really centered around community, and we use that programming to inform people on how to advocate for themselves and advocate for a plant-based food system. And I think that's extremely important. I think lobbying is extremely important as well. But how amazing would it be if we had a march, and with that march, 100,000 people showed up because we were able to recognize that interconnections of oppression in our food system, right? But our movement has failed at doing that. We have 50 million Americans who are hungry, most of whom are children, families with children. However, we keep saying veganism is going to feed the world. Veganism is going to feed the world. It's not that simple, right? There's conflict. There's so much that drives world hunger. And we need to pull ourselves back and really think about when we talk about something as a solution, what are we putting behind it for it to solve the problem? That's something that we don't do often. So the funding that we need right now is really funding to continue working on these policies. I believe that really reaching youth is really what's going to lead us forward. We're not going to be here forever. Some of us, I think, are on our way out because we need to rest as well. And so recently, we have a youth steering committee that's working on policy, again, through coalition work. And I think that is the way for us to move forward. If we do not come and realize that we need to collaborate with one another, stop the infighting, build coalition, learn how to disagree. We can disagree. We all want the same thing. We want abolition. We want animal liberation. Our youth steering committee was recently invited to the White House Conference on Hunger, Health, and Nutrition. They were supposed to be on a panel, but then they got disinvited because it's too much of a political conversation when you talk about plant-based food, but they were there. And so these are all of the things that we see and all of the achievement that we see with very, very little money. And so as I said earlier, we are resourceful. So we need money for policy work. We need money for our programming that incentivizes youth. We want to pay people. We want to pay them for our labor. Our youth steering committee gets paid for their time, right? We're not just saying, hey, here's some professional development and do all this work on our behalf. So it's extremely important to think about where do you want your money to go? And as I said before, we need to think creatively. We need to stop saying, this is too radical. It is not too radical. We have to take those chances and those opportunities. We need to fund initiatives, and I'm gonna talk just about the movement itself and beyond what I need, because I think that's important here as well. We need legal representation for activists. So fund those initiatives, especially because Black, Brown, and Indigenous people do not take certain risks because a lot of times we are afraid. I have done undercover work. But a lot of people are not comfortable in that because that may mean the life or death to them. And so fund initiatives that are focused on legal support for activists, fund initiatives that are focused on systemic change, fund policy work. And I'm not just talking about animal welfare policy or cage-free policy, and no offense to all of my amazing colleagues in the room that work on those issues, because I also think they're needed, right? Liberation is not a straight road. But I think very, very creative policies. The food system is such a way that we can come together. The Farm Bill, the EATS Act, all of these things affect everybody who's in this country, no matter where you stand on those issues and along that line of oppression, whether you have privilege or whether you don't have privilege. And if we look forward and we really think about collective liberation and fund these initiatives through organizations such as ours, we're going to see a shift in our movement. We're going to shift from telling people to eat rice and beans to people actually perhaps wanting to eat rice and beans and kale, you know, and really thinking about lots of guacamole, lots of guacamole. But it's so important to invest in youth. It's so important to invest in policy work and legal work. And I think that those are the top three, and that's what we're working on at the moment. And I don't just want the wins that are going to come from me contacting every person that I possibly can to see how we can work together. I want to rest. I think all of us want to rest. Rest is part of liberation. If we're not resting, we're not working towards freedom.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for submitting your questions. We have time for just a few. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I will start with a question that I was tempted to hide, frankly. I have the option to hide questions from the audience, but this is a question that we hear and not a question that a lot of folks are that are bold enough to ask out loud, but here it is. What if you are a white ally who wants to support a Black vegan group or movement locally, but find them to be consistently unfriendly and unwelcoming? I mean, I could answer this myself. I will pass it along for someone else to discuss. I will repeat very quickly. What if you're a white ally who wants to support a Black vegan group or movement locally, but find them to be consistently unfriendly and unwelcoming?
That's an over-scrutiny.
Yes, I mean, we can talk about over-scrutiny, we can talk about white saviorism, I know you'll get into it. I mean, this question happens, it doesn't always happen out loud, but we get this in various forms. So somebody who can quickly answer.
I think quickly, I'll just say that, kind of to Connie's point, we often, just think about a lot of the things that's happened in the movement in the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of things from a lot of organizations get overlooked by other activists. A lot of sexual allegations, a lot of accusations from tons of people in various organizations. We find a way to conveniently work with them. We find a way to conveniently still do activism with them. And we don't have those types of questions as often as we should when it comes to other social injustice issues. So I just kind of feel like sometimes questions like that can feel a little race-baiting. Like we are only going to acknowledge race and the role of problematic behavior around race, but we don't look at problematic behavior in other areas of the movement. We tend to single it out. So
I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This work is uncomfortable, and allyship is uncomfortable, and nobody can self-define themselves as an ally. It's us that get to decide if you're an ally, right? We make the rules, and I think a lot of times people who want to support think that they do, and so that may be what happens. It may be an uncomfortable space. We may tell you no, and I've been in those positions. I've had large organizations reach out to us and say, we want to do this work, and I have said absolutely not. You have been very harmful to our community. We are not in collaboration with you until you do the work yourself. And so that's what I would say to that person. It's just very simple, very direct, and if you're not ready for the discomfort, then you are not ready for healing.
Would someone like to take on quickly explaining collective animal liberation?
Do you want to go?
So in my opinion, it goes back to the whole person. When you realize that this is about animals, but it goes into the whole person, not only in your central part of your life and your decisions about what you're eating and how that affects animals, but also when it comes to if we decide to do policy work, it's that you are looking at from a lens that supports a structure that checks off the boxes of more than one thing and that you're really conscious about it. When we do policy and legislation, if you want to go to our website, you can look at our Farm Bill priorities. And no matter what the theme is, whether it's farmer access to transition money, or if it's accessibility into eating food, it always has an umbrella of making sure that there's accessibility to brown and black economic wealth, always. And the problem with where I stand in this is I'm not calling myself an ally, but I'm saying I'm trying to be an ally, is I'm not gonna do it best. I'm gonna do it from a lens that I have and try to write in stuff, but the best way to do it is to have the most diverse group of people there so that in that one shot of written legislation without 100 red lines that still don't solve the problems, in your first round, you solve all the problems. And we need to get to that point where we start taking actions that are thinking about all of these things and have the people in place to set policy legislation up so that we have full collective liberation of humans, animals, let this earth heal, let our bodies heal from being exploited from capitalism. Everyone's exploited, but let's move it into a system that goes back into the origin. The origin was that we were community focused, that we had localized food systems, that we were not obliterating land and using animals to do that. So that is what collective liberation means to me.
So, thank you, Connie. I think collective liberation is really a labor of love, and it really seeks to heal all of us. The trauma that we have, how much far we have to go. It really recognizes our entanglements and how we are bound together and how we need to move forward. It seeks collaboration, it seeks understanding, and it is a lens. And it doesn't mean, and I just want to clarify this, it doesn't mean that you have to be part of every social justice movement and show up at every protest, because I think that that's the fear, right? I think that a lot of times within animal liberation and activism, a lot of folks think, oh my goodness, not again, you're asking me to do so much when I'm doing so much already. And so it just means that we understand that without moving forward together, we are going to be held back. That it seeks freedom for everyone that's within an exploitative and extractive system that's hurting all of us. And that liberation cannot exist if all of us don't move together, if we don't pull the person behind us who perhaps may be disabled, may be trans, may be experiencing multiple identities, right? And when we talk about intersectionality, we talk a lot about humans experience an intersectionality, but we look at our beyond human relatives, and a cow is suppressed because she's a female, because she's a mother. And so these intersections of oppression exist all along the way. And when we understand collective liberation, we understand those intersections, and not only do they benefit us, but they benefit our beyond human relatives, because we challenge our speciesism. We challenge looking at them through the lens of our saviorship. So that's what collective liberation means to me.
Thank you. It is 1 minute until 5:15. Connie, if you could quickly answer this last question. What's the most important component of the Farm Bill people should be focused on changing?
Just
Oh, 1 minute.
showing up. Like, literally, how is the Farm Bill not the most important topic? I'm telling you, The most important thing is showing up. If I were to get specific, it is that all of the money designed to solve climate change, to solve, do the conservation, everything is going to big ag, everything. And so I would say finding ways for us to, it's 800 pages, so asking me for one. It's showing up and finding ways where we can add money to transition, to create specialists to transition, to make sure there's access for communities of color, to make sure that the economic wealth of plant-based farmers grows so that they can have power in the decision-making of the food system and they start lobbying more and more. By the way, I've spoken to the largest produce, fruit and vegetable organization in the United States that represents all of their farmers, and with the data proving that there's fraud on the other side, they are ready to show up for people and say that we are going to help with your health issues. We're going to help with accessibility. Also spoke to the Soy Association, the largest soy group in America. And so what I want people to focus on is showing up and putting everything you have in your best shot forward into this. And then lastly, I want to incubate anybody that wants to show up with us. I want to create the biggest amount of vegans who are also lobbyists who then have a revolving door to become a politician, and I want it to all tie together. Let's all get involved in the Farm Bill and let's put our best foot forward.
Vegan Voter Hub.
Vegan Voter Hub, yes. Vegan Voter Hub, I need constituents. I need to be able to go to these meetings and say, I have 1,000 vegans in your district, right? I need constituents. I have 650 members who are paying monthly members, and I have 3 lobbyists from it. So please go on the Vegan Voter Hub and sign up to get so that I can have constituents to back all of this up.
Instead of asking each of you how everyone can support your work, I think Eloisa was very succinct about that. The open your purse speech, let's call it. Instead, I will wrap this up and say thank you to each of you from me. Thank you to the audience, and I hope this was insightful. I hope it was uncomfortable, and I hope you reach out to each of these panelists and get involved with supporting and uplifting their work. Thank you very much.